Okay, today on the bench we have a pair of radios here, different models and different makes, and even from different decades. Not that far apart. They're probably a little bit less than about 10 years apart. Um, this one actually has a manufacture date on the serial number plate. I think it's like October 1986. So what we have here is a Royce 607, and this is and as you can hear, that one's actually hooked up to an antenna. And this one is a Cobra 29. Now, the first thing you're probably thinking is, Mike, that ain't a Cobra 29. Well, actually, it is. So if we take a closer look here, Cobra 29 Plus. So yeah, the Cobra 29 came in lots of different versions over the years. And a lot of people don't even realize that the original Cobra 29 was a 23 channel radio. So yeah, it's, probably, there's probably no probablys about it. It is the longest used model number probably in CB history. I mean, the Cobra 29 in some variant has been around a long, long time. So, wrong direction there. So, the reason I'm doing both of these together, they both belong to the same customer. He sent both of these in at the same time. Basically didn't need any repairs. They both work. Just wanted them recapped, clean out any corrosive glue, and do an alignment on them, which I did. And I had to wire up a microphone that he sent for the Royce. This one microphone came with it and worked fine. But I thought I'd just do these together because it's not like these are some super special sideband radio. They're both AM only radios, but they do share a few things in common, actually. One of those being the final transistor. So these are kind of, I obviously don't want to say they're unique because they both use a kind of a similar RF amplifier circuit. Most people would be familiar, especially like the Cobra 29s, 2SC2078 for the final. This does not have that. And then a radio in this vintage usually would have had, depending on make and model, could have used like a 2SC 1969 or something like that. Well, neither of these use that. Both of these radios use especially in the vintage of this radio, what would normally be usually a driver transistor. So it has a 2SC 2166 is being used in both of these as the final transistor. And actually, this one right here, we can get zoomed in enough, be able to see that maybe. I need to get a little bit more. Let me just turn on my overhead light here. I know this new camera having its higher resolution, I'm finding that the higher resolution cameras really need more light than what I was using before. Yeah, there we can see in focus. So yeah, you can see we have a 2SC2166. And just looking at the layout, zoom out here just a little bit, this looks kind of similar to what you'd see in most radios. In most radios, you'd see this smaller package transistor with a little heatsink attached to it. It would be your pre-driver, then you would have a driver, and then usually somewhere around here, there would be a final. Yeah, there just is no final. And the radio puts out, it does. Actually, this one, now neither of these, of course, are going to be power monsters, which you shouldn't be doing that anyhow. It's just hard on the radios to start with. But both of these radios, when I did the transceiver alignments on them, of course, you always adjust for maximum RF power, and then you adjust down to 4 watts. This one would go up to about 5 watts. So, of course, and then I adjusted it back down to a 4-watt carrier. But, yeah, it's not like it has a 1969 final or a 2SC 1307 or something where you would even be able to get massive amounts of power out of it. And that's, like I say, that's perfectly fine. It does what it's supposed to do. Now, this Cobra, and they both kind of actually have some, again, it's not unique circuits, but stuff that you don't see a lot, especially this one, if you consider there's no channel selector knob like this radio. This this radio is all push buttons except for, your normal control. So volume, squelch, mic gain, RF gain, your meter selection, and SWR cal. But A&L noise blanker, PA dimmer, so yes, it has a dimmer switch. If we get off of channel, has a dedicated channel 19 button, channel 9 button, and it has up and down buttons. But as you can see, these are push buttons. And I kind of like those. I'm honestly not a huge fan of slide switches like this. Just they're tiny, and yeah, especially when you get a line of them lined up, trying to get in there, especially if you've got big meat paws, trying to get in there, those tiny little switches. These are fairly big buttons, so yeah, even somebody with big fat fingers can get in there and blink, turn the A&L and the noise blanker on, and not worry about hitting other stuff. So this has, of course, a little bit of extra circuitry because because everything is push-button switches, so it needs a different way of programming the PLL. So it has a little bit of additional circuitry here because it's being done digitally instead of with an analog rotary switch. But otherwise, a lot of the layout looks is pretty much the same. Your modulation audio circuit over here, RF final, your PLL synthesizer circuit, your receiver circuit kind of wraps around here. So most of the rest of it's still pretty much the same as other radios. It's just as far as channel selection goes, that's being done digitally. Rest of the radio, yeah, pretty much standard. The Royce 607, however, uses, now again, it's not a normal PLL, but it's, because Royce always kind of did their own thing. They were not known for doing, what do you want to say, following the pack, and I don't want to say they were a leader in the pack, but yeah, they did their own thing. Royce radios, especially if you work on Royce radios, you'll quickly find that, yeah, they're kind of all to their own, just the way they did things. One of the first things is it has this huge IC right here. Well, that huge IC is not the PLL. The PLL is over here. This is the PLL VCO IC. And again, like I say, it's kind of an oddball one. I think that's a 3002 if I remember right. But what this big IC here does is actually replaces numerous parts in this radio. You'll notice there's a lot less solid state devices as far as like transistors and whatnot than in, let's say, a radio like this. That's because everything's being done inside of this IC. This thing does a lot. It's used for the RF amplifier. It's used for the first mixer. It's used for the second mixer. It's used for the first IF amplifier. It's used for the AGC amplifier. It's used for the squelch circuit. I mean, it does a lot. So, anything happens to that IC, it's definitely going to kill the radio because it controls so much. You can almost think of it as early microprocessor. But again, simple board layout design, just like this radio over here. This uses a 2SC2166 for a final. Again, it does not have a standard, what you would normally see in most radios, a pre-driver and then two larger transistors, a driver and a final. It's just, you look in one of these and you just think, where's the final? Well, yeah, they did it differently. It's not again, this one, just like the other radio, it's not a power monster, but it by no means has any problem reaching power. This one was easily going up over 5 watts, and of course adjusted it back down to a 4-watt carrier when I did the transceiver alignment on it. And they're both good working radios. Now, the Cobra is in, let me get the camera leveled out here. The Cobra is in much, much, much better physical condition. I don't want to say this one's new, but this one was really well taken care of and didn't look like it was really used that much. The Royce, on the other hand, looks like it got used a fair bit, and unfortunately, it got dropped at some point because it does have some cosmetic flaws. So it's got kind of obviously there. It was dropped on this corner and it crunched the bezel and actually bent the aluminum plate right there on the front of the radio a little bit. It was also the faceplate bezel. I don't know if it was paint overspray, but from the top side, man, the chrome just looked nasty. The knobs, especially the top sides of the knobs, was nasty. Like I say, it doesn't look like atmospheric fallout, just dirt or even tar and nicotine. It was more looked like paint over spray of some sort. So with a little bit of chrome polish, I was actually able to get the bezel. I mean, other than this damage right here, I got the bezel cleaned up. It actually looks really good, the top side. As well as the knobs, and I tried cleaning them with just normal cleaner, and yeah, it wasn't doing so much. So I also had to actually polish the knobs to get that kind of oversprayish stuff off of them. But yeah, as soon as I did that, chrome's, you can see nice shiny knobs now, and it does have the black insert, which was common on Royce radios. Now, these knobs don't have it, but this one has the little black, like, rawhide, simulated, let me rephrase that, simulated rawhide inserts in there, which was a common thing on Royce radios. But, and actually a few other manufacturers did that, but that was common on Royce's. But there you go, so there's two, and this customer apparently, he let me know that he's got around 30 radios he started collecting, and he's doing his best to rescue unwanted radios from the trash. And a lot of people look at this, well, Mike, they're not sideband radios. What I want them for? Well, honestly, there's a whole lot more people that talk AM. But when it comes to CB radio, there's a whole lot more people that talk AM than talk sideband. There's actually very few people that talk sideband. Truckers, people in local groups. I mean, even like around here at night, channel 12, 17. Sometimes they're on 21 or 28, but that's all AM communications. None of those guys are talking sideband. So these are perfectly good radios. They're good working radios. They were built, back in the day when radios were had better build quality. Now this one I will say, just as a design, I don't know if I'd call it a flaw. It's just something I've never been a fan of because it tends to fail more frequently than not. Let me get oh shoot, I didn't take the screws off of the top cover. So actually I'll have to pop them out because I was actually done with this radio and put it back together and then did the Royce. And I thought, well, I'll just show both of them at the same time. So let me just get the top cover off. So if you own one of these Cobra 29 Plus radios and you ever end up with lots of weird problems happening with the faceplate, or channels aren't changing, any of the switches, anything like that not working, before you go panicking, the first thing you should check, edge connector. Yes, this has a huge strip of solder connections. Okay. Come on, get off of there. So right there along the front edge, yes, it has the edge board solder connections. So first thing you want to do is check to make sure there's not any broken solder joints there. I always recommend people do it. I do it myself, and it was done to this radio. I resoldered all of these. Now, when I say resoldered, I don't mean I just grabbed a soldering iron, came in here, and touched each solder joint, maybe added a little bit of solder. No, don't do that. That's old nasty solder. What you want to do is completely desolder all of these. I think the big problems, especially on a radio like this, as it gets older, these are not high quality circuit boards. It's not the manufacturer's fault. This is a consumer, honestly, a lower dollar consumer level electronics device. It's not like this is a piece of test equipment. They're not going to spend hundreds of dollars putting the highest quality circuit boards in here they can. It's cheap consumer level electronics, so they're going to use cheap consumer level circuit boards, which is what they have in them. And they can change dimensions physically over the decades, because these things are not a good high quality fiberglass board. Honestly, I don't really know what they make these, some type of phenolic type material, whatever it is they're made out of. But it can change dimensions. Not only that, plastic stuff like the faceplate, if it's putting pressure, because you can see there's little cutouts in this front circuit board for the front of the radio. Those cutouts are notched into the plastic of the faceplate. So if the plastic, again, if it changes dimensions and whatnot, over time, shrinkage or expansion, it puts a lot of stress on these solder connections. So I always recommend completely desolder it. The second reason you want to completely desolder it is you don't know exactly what type of solder you're dealing with. What type of solder are you using and what type of solder is already on her. That's why anytime you replace a part, it's best to completely desolder it. That way there's no solder other than a little bit of tinning that'll be left on the pads. You'll have all the old solder off. That way you're not mixing compositions. And when you do that, you don't know what blend you're ending up with. You don't know what the physical properties are of that solder. But, when I completely desolder this thing, I know what's going back on there. I'm using a silver composition solder. I use the silver solder, especially on stuff like this, has nothing to do with conductivity. Anybody that ever tells you they've got some fancy special solder, like audio solder, that these rip-off companies are overcharging people and honestly other companies for, I don't know, what, $100 a spool for some rip-off roll of solder that they say is going to make your audio sound better. BS. That's all that is. What they're doing is they're taking money out of your wallet. That's all they're doing. They're trying to get into your wallet. Yeah, don't fall for the smoke and mirrors or fancy advertising. Just buy a good quality solder. Now, you don't have to use silver solder, but like I say, I like using a 2% silver solder. It's a SN62 composition for the simple reason SN62 composition has the highest tensile strength of any solder. So any solder meant for electronics, that has the highest tensile strength. This is something where tensile strength really comes into play. Now, other things like components that, may go, you're soldered down here on the bottom of the board, but you're attached to, let's say, the steel chassis. Again, that can put a lot of stress on solder joints for components that are mounted to the chassis, but soldered down to the board, because as the steel chassis expands and contracts, it's putting a lot of stress on those solder connections. That's why I use silver solder. It has nothing to do with conductivity. It has all to do about physical strength of the solder. And it just happens, it makes really nice shiny connections. But yes, so when I desoldered this one as an example, when I got down to these last two, because I use what they call, with the paste desoldering iron that I use, they have this tip here. It's called a flow desolder tip. It's actually meant for cleaning off circuit pads on surface mount components. So like when you remove a BGA or let's say a quad flat pack or something, this tip's meant to actually clean the traces off. But it also works really well for cleaning this kind of stuff off too, because that's basically what they are, just a bunch of flat pads. So I'd desolder like 2 or 3 pads at a time. When I got down here to these last two, as soon as those last two pads melted, I heard pop. It popped apart a little bit. There was a lot of stress on there. So that's another reason I like to do it. The radio's been, this 1986, so it's got a lot of age to it. So by removing all of the existing solder, it allows the boards to basically go wherever they want to and rest in their new natural location, and then I can come back in and resolder all these connections, but there's no real stress on them now, because the board, when it went pop, it moved to wherever it wants to happily live now, and I resoldered them. It's taking all that stress off. So yeah, I always recommend, just anytime you see those, just resolder them. I don't care if it's even a new radio, because honestly most of these new radios that use edge solder connections like this, they use such a small amount of solder that I don't know how they make it out of the factory. And to make matters worse, anything that's been made for the last several years is going to be lit. Now this radio is back when they were still using leaded solder, but what they're using for manufacturing nowadays is lead-free solder. Again, not the greatest stuff. Doesn't have an extremely high tensile strength. So, and especially when you're working on new radios, so not something like this, but a new radio, if you're going to resolder those. If you're using a lead-type solder, you definitely want to remove all of the existing solder, because it's bad enough mixing different unknown compositions of leaded solder, but if you're going to be mixing unleaded solder with leaded solder, you really have you could come up with something that's even more brittle than what you're replacing. So, best idea, desolder, resolder. Doesn't take that long. Even if you don't have a fancy desoldering iron, try and reach over here and grab a roll. Something like desoldering braid works just fine. God, I've got one around here somewhere. I've never use them. I've got fancy soldering equipment. I just keep them here for demonstration. Where the heck is it? There it is. It's over here in one of my toolboxes. solder suckers. You know, these simple little plunger style, you know, you load them and push the button, you know. I hate these things because honestly they don't work that well. But honestly, for something like this, they don't do too bad. Because there's no terminal leads sticking up, you can just like pull like the kind of lay your soldering iron on there, pull the blob of solder over, get this in there and suck up huge blobs of solder at a, you know, in one fell swoop with something like this. These actually aren't too bad for doing that, but yeah, just get the solder out of there. And it's just honestly, the best advice I can give for any type of soldering. Bad solder joints, don't just reflow them. I see people, especially radios like these, old radios that have been, and they don't even honestly need to be old. I see radios from the 90s and the 2000s where horrible solder connections, and I'm not talking about factory solder work. I'm talking about, you know, stuff that a repair shop did. So, you know, Galaxies, or actually I should say Ranger, RCI Rangers are known for that. They have probably the absolute worst soldering of anything electronic I have ever seen. Their soldering just sucks. There's hardly any of it, and whatever composition of solder they use, I think glass is less fragile than the solder that they use. But you'll see stuff that has lots of leads, all those wiring harnesses that have plug connectors on the end. They'll be broken out just everywhere, just horrible solder joint problems. When you're repairing something like that, make sure you remove the old solder. But I see it so many times. You'll look in there and you'll see these big blobs of solder on solder connections, and the solder connection's still bad. That's because their blob of solder might be stuck to the terminal lead, but it's not actually stuck to the copper trace down on the board. So, very important. Remove the old solder. You'll just end up with a much more reliable joint that, honestly, you may never have to repair again if you do it properly. So, any case, there's my kind of a rant on soldering and whatnot. But, like I say, this radio is really nice. You can see nice and shiny. This one over here, like I say, it's got a flaw there, but yeah, otherwise, nice working radio. Sounds good. They both receive well, both transmit fine. So there you go. Royce Model 607 and a Cobra 29 Plus.